Welcome, I'm your host, Malcolm Gallagher. From our BizVision studios in the UK, you're watching the BVTV network. Now, constantly hitting us on TV, YouTube, and wherever you can see visual communication, there's a vast range of travel commercials for Saudi Arabia, and I must say, their images look exciting and tempting. But if you then read the business and political news, the welcome seems a little bit tarnished. So what's the real story? What do we need to know about Saudi Arabia to make reasoned judgment? Is it the place to comfortably and transparently do business, for example? For conscious leaders of conscious businesses, should it be on their target or growth list, or should they be wary with elements such as human rights infringement, bribery laws, duty of care, and so on? Now, you and I could read umpteen for and against articles on Saudi Arabia and still have little authentic advice or information. So today, I'm delighted to be introducing you to someone who does know the reality. In fact, he's written the definitive book, Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. Now, as you can probably see from the screen behind me, renowned former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said my guest's book was clear-eyed and illuminating. And again, on the screen behind me, General David Petraeus, former director of the CIA, said of the book that it's rich, superbly researched, balanced history of the modern kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So let's go and meet author and Saudi Arabia expert, David Rundell. Welcome, David.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be chatting with you today.
Yeah,
I look forward to it.
I'm fascinated where you are, David, because trying to follow you around the world is, I need a big map.
Yeah, well, I'm in Delaware today visiting my mother. I usually live in Dubai, London, or Texas. So those are my three usual homes.
Right. And it's not because you like quarantining, is it, that you're traveling that much?
No, I just came to see my mother who's
Yeah,
been a little bit quiet with her COVID lockdown.
Yeah, I totally agree. I wish I could do the same. David, I'm delighted you're kindly guesting on our BVTV network. Now, in this BVTV show, I'll be talking to David in three parts. First, I'll ask him to look back over, say, the last 10 years or so. What's been happening in Saudi Arabia all around, especially in business? Have dealings become more transparent? Have we been misled in what we see coming out of the kingdom in communications? What's happened in those 10 years? In part two, we'll move to talking about where Saudi Arabia is now in his expert eyes. Should a conscious leader have his or her eyes open wide on doing business with the country? What does he say about it all in his book? And in part three, we'll have a serious talk on his best guesses for the future of external relationships with the kingdom. Will travel become big? Will there be stability? What does business need to know, and more? But David, before we get into our three-part talk, can you please briefly introduce yourself to my viewers and listeners? Who is David Rundell? Why are you so expert on Saudi Arabia? And what caused you to write your book?
Okay. I was a Foreign Service officer in the American Diplomatic Service for 30 years.
Wow.
Of that 30 years, I spent half of it in one country, which is Saudi Arabia. The rest of it I spent in Washington or other Arab countries. That is extremely unusual. Mm-hmm. Most diplomats go to a country once and maybe come back a second time, but the idea that they go back 7 or 8 times, as I did, is very unusual. Over that time, I worked in and was later the head of, the chief of, what they call counselor for political affairs, economic affairs, commercial affairs. I was the deputy chief of mission. I was the chief of mission. I retired as the chief of mission. So I had a unique experience in Saudi Arabia that was unique, not just for Saudi Arabia, but really for any country in the world, that someone had that level and depth of experience in one country. And many people encouraged me to not let all that knowledge disappear when I left. And it was gathered over a period of 30 years. I first went there in 1980. And I finished up in 2010, and now I live in Dubai and I have a consulting business. So when there's no COVID, I'm in Saudi Arabia pretty much every month, even today. So I've really been watching the place for 40 years, and both as a private sector consultant, which gives you a different perspective than the embassy. So I have had a long experience with Saudi Arabia and a very varied experience. And that's, I think, the part I would emphasize is varied. That this is, you could go to Saudi Arabia and be an engineer for Aramco and run the same pump station for 30 years, and you probably wouldn't have a very limited view. But my different jobs gave me a very wide exposure to many different things in the country. And I traveled extensively in the country. So that's why I am sort of considered to be America's, well, usually I'm considered to be America's leading expert on Saudi Arabia.
And that's why we're so delighted to be able to chat to you, especially your book seems to grab people, as Kissinger and Petraeus have said as well. So let's start our talk in part one. Can you please look back over, we'll say, the last 10 years? I know you've done 40 there, but the last 10 years or so, what's been happening in Saudi Arabia across the country, especially in business? Have dealings become more transparent? Have we been misled in what we see coming out of the kingdom in communications? What's happened in those 10 years?
Well, in the past 5 years, there has been a very dramatic change in Saudi Arabia. I would say before that, there was a considerable continuity that hadn't changed much in 30 years. But with the arrival of King Salman and his son, Mohammed bin Salman, things have been changing very rapidly. And they were changing rapidly in social, economic, and political spheres. Socially, I think most of your viewers are well aware of the fact that there's been a profound liberalization in Saudi Arabia, which was a very conservative, religiously conservative society. Part of the reason for that was its isolation from the global mainstream of culture. And so many things that had once been common in the West remained common in Saudi Arabia when they had changed. One of the most stark examples of this is the role of women. Another would be the role of religion. There was a film I saw on an airplane, which is where I often am, called All Be True, about Shakespeare. And I was watching that film, and I was struck by many interesting parts of it. But one was Shakespeare was back at Stratford upon Avon, and his wife says, "Well, we've got to go to church." She says, "You're not in London anymore. If you don't go to church, you're going to get fined here." And I thought, wow, that's interesting. That's just like Saudi Arabia. They have a religious police who tell you you're going to get fined. And then he's worried, Shakespeare's worried about the fact that when his daughter gets married, all the property he's leaving her is going to go to her husband. So this is, again, was not that their inheritance laws were quite like that, but the role of women were very different in our history, and we've changed and they didn't. And the reason they didn't was because they were isolated by a sea of sand. Basically, nobody went there. One of the features of Saudi Arabia is that it was never colonized. It's the only Arab country that was never colonized. The reason it wasn't colonized is because nobody wanted to go there. There wasn't anything to get. So they were very much caught in amber in a different century. Yeah. That has dramatically changed in the last 5 years. Not just have women been allowed to drive, which everyone's heard about that, but the guardianship rules were removed. By and large, women used to need written permission from their husband or their father to do a whole range of things: get a passport, open a business, travel outside the country, have a cesarean delivery, you name it. You needed written permission to do all these things. That is by and large been eliminated. Girls can now go to gym classes, which they couldn't do. They're now able to practice in many professions like lawyer or geologist or engineer, which they used to not be allowed to do. And that's true in England. You know, I have a flat in London, and right near my flat is one of those blue plaques they put on the wall, which says this is the home of the first woman who was allowed to practice medicine in Britain, and that was in the 1850s. So it's a while ago, but there was a time when women couldn't practice medicine in Britain as well. So many of these changes have affected gender equality, but they've also affected religious customs and social customs. So again, there were no movie theaters. Movie theaters were considered bad, morally bad, rather like plays were in Puritan times in Britain. Even plays, there weren't plays as well. That was another thing. So that's all changed. Music has become allowed now. And the religious police have been taken off the street largely. There used to be effectively they were religious police who went around and enforced prayer time and such things, and they've basically been defanged. So there's a huge amount of social change. Most of it very popular with the young population. This has been done in conjunction with economic change.
Right. Okay.
The plan for economic change is to diversify the economy, to balance the budget, to find other alternatives for government revenues besides oil. And those things were going reasonably well. First of all, they're more difficult to do. You can just decide we're going to open movie theaters by fiat. You can't just decide you're going to diversify your economy by fiat. So while they were able to raise taxes and reduce spending, the diversification and the creation of jobs were going okay. They were making progress, but then COVID came, and COVID set them back. It set back the efforts to diversify the economy, to balance the budget, and that's in large part because COVID led to a dramatic fall in oil prices, although that we're recovering from that today. So they're making economic changes. They have a plan. I mean, they have quite an elaborate plan of how they're going to diversify the economy, and they're working toward that. You asked specifically about things that have changed in the business world. Quite a lot, actually. They're beginning to codify laws. For a long time, they simply used the Sharia code. The judges did not really, who are mostly religious scholars, did not really want a codified law. And so judges had a great deal of autonomy in how they interpreted laws. And you could have different judges saying precedent was not considered that important. That is gradually changing and making it a much easier and more predictable place to do business. Corruption is one of the things that the king is very much opposed to and has done quite a lot. I think anyone who goes to Saudi Arabia would find that there's a good deal less corruption at all levels than there used to be. There is more transparency. There are new laws that cover many things from shipping to bankruptcy. So their intellectual property is being protected better. So by and large, the economic changes are moving in the right direction. Politically, if anything, Saudi Arabia is not, the king is not trying to make Saudi Arabia into a democracy. He's trying to preserve the monarchy. He has, the country has become more authoritarian, and power has become more concentrated. There was a period for really 40, 50 years where power was shared by the sons of King Ibn Saud. He had 34 sons that survived him, and they were not all equal, but they did share power, and they transferred power from one brother to another. The biggest political change is the end of that system. We at some point had to go to the grandsons of Ibn Saud, and that was always going to be difficult, challenging, potentially very destabilizing, because there were over 500 grandsons. and they all thought that they were well qualified to become the king.
Yeah.
And power was diversified enough, divided enough amongst them that they could have had a real Game of Thrones. King Salman short-circuited that. He, through a very deliberate, meticulous, relentless process, sidetracked everybody else. He chose the guy he wanted. He put him in power, and it's pretty unlikely that anyone can oppose him now. So the succession has largely been resolved, and that's the biggest political change, although that has also led to this concentration of political power. Some people would argue is not a good thing. Other people would say you had to do that if you were going to make the social and economic changes. And I think there's truth in both arguments.
Can I ask you, slip in a personal question here? If we take those 40 years of your involvement in Saudi and your excellent work that you were doing there for the US government, which of the years would you like to be, would you think would be the best, that where it is at the moment, where it first started, which would you pick as the most ideal for you to be working there?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, for the most people, the time to be there is now. I mean, I had some interesting personal experiences. I was there during Operation Desert Storm.
Right.
That was the first and only time, fortunately for me, that I've been involved in a war. That was, although I was also involved in the Al-Qaeda terrorist insurrection, which wasn't exactly a war, but actually there were probably more people getting killed in that than there were in the Operation Desert Storm. And I helped to rebuild the relationship after 9/11. So from a personal point of view, those were interesting episodes. But from the point of view of an average businessman, I would say today's the time you want to be in Saudi Arabia. Things are changing rapidly. Opportunities are developing. The privatization is a big issue today. Things are being privatized. All of these things have been on the plan. They've been talked about for years. Creating jobs for Saudis, privatizing government assets. They just didn't happen. Now they have a bulldozer of a crown prince who is making things happen. And he's concentrated power enough so that he's able to make things happen. So in terms of business, I would say if you want to do serious business, this is the time to be there. There were times after the oil boom where you could make a quick dollar or a quick pound, and selling pretty much anything you wanted to, at that time, rather naive consumers. Those days are gone. So I think if you're someone dealing with long-term business opportunities, today's probably the best you'll have seen.
Fascinating. David, before we move to part two, I'd just like to remind viewers and listeners how to get your book, which you can see, viewers and listeners, the front covers on the screen behind me, and pop along to that well-known place called Amazon. And that's where I've taken the screenshots of the book there. And also you can just see there the comments by Henry Kissinger and General Petraeus. Those are excellent comments, by the way, David. I congratulate you. And just to remind listeners that the title of the book is Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. I'll say that again, listeners, Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. David, time for part two. I just want to continue this talk about where Saudi Arabia is now in your expert eyes. And here in the UK in particular, by the way, the UK could fit 9 times approximately into Saudi Arabia. So here in the UK, we're very much in business on a conscious approach, planet, people, profits, and there, but also in compliance and concern about bribery. Should a conscious leader have his or her eyes wide open on doing business with the country? What do you say about that? About what you say about today in your book?
Well, I would say that King Salman has long been opposed to corruption. And corruption did exist in Saudi Arabia at various levels. King Salman was in charge basically of Riyadh. He was the governor of Riyadh province. And to the extent that he was able to, he kept corruption limited in Riyadh. And he was diligent about that. He was not able to control all of his brothers. And so when he became king, he started to change the way things were done throughout the country. And he believes that corruption is a detriment to economic development. And so he's tried to rein it in. And he has done so. I mean, he started at the top. The collection of people they put in the Ritz-Carlton were people that were widely known, or at least suspected, of being in some way corrupt. Now, you have to understand, corruption had a different connotation. So these people did not actually think of themselves as criminals. Many of them thought it was perfectly acceptable. The king changed the rules and told them this is not perfectly acceptable, and you're going to have to pay back some of the money you got. And it wasn't just, the Ritz-Carlton is a famous episode because of the stature of the people that were put in there, but it didn't end with them. Just last week, they rounded up a few more colonels and majors. And again, people have said, and I disagree with them when they say that this was all a power grab. No, the Ritz-Carlton was not a power grab. By the time that they did that, they'd already grabbed power. The reason that they were able to get away with it was because they'd already grabbed power. The people they put in the Ritz were not a threat to Mohammed bin Salman and his father. And the people they just put in jail last week were certainly not any kind of threat to them. So they're making it very clear that embezzlement, bribery, phony contracts, preference on contracts, these are not things that are acceptable anymore. So for a British businessman and an American businessman, we have been to some extent handicapped by this. You have your bribery law. We have what we call the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And they make it a crime for Americans to engage in, or British subjects to engage in practices which many other countries, citizens do quite regularly. So we were at a handicap. And I was the commercial chief in the American Embassy for a while. And I remember when I started that work, I thought we are really at a disadvantage here. This law they made for the Americans is really not helping us. But the more I became experienced, the more I became a strong supporter of that law. And it's similar to the one that you have, because you do not want businessmen going from London or Newcastle to Saudi Arabia and practicing corruption and thinking it's okay there and then coming back, because pretty soon they're going to start coming back to Newcastle and doing it in Newcastle. And then you're going to have it imported to yourself. And you don't need that, because corruption is a real tax. It is a tax, and it is detrimental to economic growth and development. So I think it's a good thing we had that law, and I think it's a good thing that Saudi Arabia is now basically going to make everybody play by those same rules. So
excellent,
So that I would say is not something. I wouldn't say it doesn't exist anymore, but the other point I would say is that now this they have this hotline where citizens can call up. So if you go and ask somebody asks you for a bribe, you can call the government and say, this guy just asked me for a bribe, and it can be anonymous. And another thing which is changing it is that a lot of bidding is now being done online. So it's not that some little bureaucrat in the office can say, oh, this guy's my cousin, I'm going to give him the contract. No, all the bids are right there on screen and everybody can look at them. So it's pretty obvious what's happening. So corruption is definitely going down in Saudi Arabia.
That's brilliant. And that's great news, isn't it, for people who want to do serious business. So let's talk about in part 3 and have a serious talk about your best guesses for the future of external relationships with the kingdom. Will travel become big as an industry? Will there be increasing stability? What's going to happen with elements such as climate change and planet and technology? What does business need to know about tomorrow so that it can go and do business with Saudi Arabia?
Well, that's a whole series of questions. Each one could be a
Yeah, I
whole
know.
part.
I'm getting as many as I can in,
Yeah,
David.
well, I'll try and answer as many as I can. The first question was about tourism. Before oil, the Saudi economy effectively ran on tourism, which is to say religious tourism. They have a monopoly on Mecca.
Yeah.
1.4 billion people are supposed to visit Mecca once in their lifetime. So they've been in the tourism business for a long time. It's just that these people were called Hajis, not tourists.
Yeah.
They are expanding the Hajj business. And that is something that they will diversify and have already done to diversify their economy. In terms of non-religious tourism, they had very little. Until just last year, there wasn't even a tourist visa. You couldn't go to Saudi Arabia. One of the reasons Saudi Arabia is poorly understood is because they've made it rather difficult to get there in the past. That's changing. They are now becoming much more welcoming, and they are attempting to develop things that people would want to go and see. Now, as we were talking earlier before we started, Saudi Arabia is not London or Paris. There are not centuries worth of historic buildings or great museums, but there are unique things which are interesting to see. Riyadh is an interesting city. Jeddah is an interesting city. Riyadh has several museums which focus on Saudi Arabia's history. Jeddah has an old section of the town, which is a well-preserved, probably the best preserved Arab city, certainly in the GCC, with several hundred-year-old houses, and you can see that. And then there's the Medan Saleh, which is a Saudi version of Petra. If people have been to Jordan, they've seen the Nabatean ruins there. And then there's the wildlife, which I always enjoyed. I spent a lot of time in the desert just traveling about looking at the animals which live there, which are ibex and oryx and various kinds of gazelles. And it's an interesting place. So, and then finally, there's the sea. And there is a very good scuba diving and quite spectacular reef fish in the Red Sea. Not so much in the Persian Gulf, which is much shallower, but the Red Sea has a fantastic collection of things to see. And they're trying to build resorts on islands in the Red Sea, which will cater to Westerners. So I think there is definitely a future for tourism, non-religious tourism in Saudi Arabia. The second question was about, what was the second question?
Oh, well, what was asking you the second question? I was asking you about the external relationships.
Oh, external relations,
yeah.
right. That's a totally, and stability, that was the other
one.
Saudi Arabia for a long time has been more stable than many people predicted. There are dozens of books written predicting the collapse of Saudi Arabia, and they have all been proven wrong. Today, I would say that Saudi Arabia has become less stable than many people presume. And the reason that it is less stable is quite simply because it's changing very rapidly. Something that is standing still is obviously it's almost a tautology, is much more stable than something that is dramatically changing. So it is less stable. I think you need to draw a clear distinction between less stable and unstable. it's not unstable. I don't expect that the monarchy is going to collapse, but it is going through change. There's a fellow by the name of Ian Bremmer at something called the Eurasia Group wrote a book called The J Curve, in which he talks about change, how when change begins to take place rapidly, a society which had been going along flat begins to become less stable, but then it turns up again and makes a J. So there's a period of time when things become less stable. Hopefully the idea is that those changes will make it more stable in the future. And I think Saudi Arabia will actually come out of the J and end up stable in the long run. But right now it's going through some very significant changes. And the reason that it was stable, I think, is something that might be worth just briefly touching on. There were really 4 legs of Saudi stability, all of which contributed to the legitimacy of the government. The reason the country was stable was because the people considered their government legitimate. The first really was the fact that Ibn Saud, the father of the current king, essentially created the country, essentially knit together a wide range of towns and villages and tribes to create a modern country that had not existed before. So he was in many ways the same as Bismarck in creating modern Germany, or Cavour creating Italy, or some medieval kings who created France and Britain. He was uniting the country. So that gave them historic legitimacy as, if you will, the founders of the country. The second fact was that there are stakeholders in the Saudi regime who they have their interests have been taken care of. The kingdom, the monarchy has balanced the interests of different stakeholders, which are essentially 5: the tribes, the religious establishment, the merchants, the technocrats, and the royal family itself. And the balancing that they have done of those stakeholders has been quite effective. They take from one and give to the other, and the next day they reverse it. So it's we balance political tensions through elections. One guy wins, the other guy loses. They don't have elections, so they rely on the monarchy to do this balancing act. The third reason they've been legitimate is essentially because they provided competent government, which really dealt with 3 things. First of all was security. They kept the country out of wars. If you look at the other countries in the Arab world, they've had far more wars, far more revolutions, far more civil wars than the Saudis. So they kept peace. With the exception of the Al-Qaeda insurrection, there's been domestic security for the best part of 70 years. So they provided security. They provided economic progress, which anyone who was in Saudi Arabia in 1980 would be amazed to see the changes and of course that was all done by oil money. But there are a lot of people who have oil money and didn't do very well. I mean, you look at Nigeria, they have oil money and they're still impoverished. And you just read last week that 300 girls in a boarding school get kidnapped. I mean, that doesn't happen in Saudi Arabia. It used to, 100 years ago, but the current monarchy makes sure that that doesn't happen. You look at Venezuela, they've got actually, if you count their tar sands, more oil than the Saudis, and yet they can't even feed themselves. People are fleeing Venezuela to get to Colombia. So the Saudis did a pretty good job on security and prosperity. And the third thing that they did for what I consider competent government is what you would call, I guess you would call it gradual social change. I guess that would be the best way I would define it. They let the society evolve. Sometimes the royal family pushed, like they did in girls' education. There was strong opposition to that, and the royal family, mainly King Faisal, pushed it. Usually they kind of wait until there's a consensus and then they push it over the line. But it would be a mistake to think that the Saudi monarchy is some reactionary force holding back people who are chafing at the bit for change. Actually, it's the other way around. If anything, they're pushing change, or at least moving at the pace that the people find acceptable. So people have considered the government to be stable because those three things. That's one reason it's been stable, is that they provided prosperity, they provided security, and they provided gradual social change. So all of those things have made Saudi Arabia stable, but all of those things are now in flux. Anyway, that I think is a question of stability.
I think what was fascinating about what you were saying there, David, and we're very much involved with procurement officers and, exporting. And after Brexit, we're looking for new markets around the world there. And until I've had this conversation with you, I think a lot of businesses would have put Saudi Arabia way down on their list of prospective countries. So it's a great reason for people to go out and buy your book. I just remind people again, it's on the screen behind me, viewers, but for listeners, it is Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads, and it's by David Rundell. David, Saudi Arabia is a rapidly changing socioeconomic landscape, as you've been explaining to me. Should it be firmly on the list of countries to do business with or travel to? I think David has given us really good pause for thought, and perhaps it should be on our list. My guest today, David Rundell, has certainly given us the right balanced viewpoint. Many thanks, David, for a great interview.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to chat with you, and they were all good questions. I enjoyed it.